My bad. If anybody was tapped into the live, my bad. My live went out. So what we gonna do is we gonna start this thing from the TOP. Peace Foundational Black American Family. It's your boy FBA Stoic in the building. Today, the live is about the historical voting patterns of foundational Black Americans, how we been drifting back and forth with our voting patterns, starting off with one party, drifting off to another party, and pretty much a surface idea how we end up where we at today, being slave masters on the Democrat plantation now, but being a Democratic biggest voting bloc in American history. You know what I'm saying? So let's get into it. The live is called "The Political System Needed Foundational Black American Votes, but didn't deliver on FBA results." Today, we're going to talk about something that most people was never taught clearly: the history of how American political system has affected foundational Black Americans over time, on policies we voted for, how these policies affected us over time. And what might surprise a lot of people is that foundational Black Americans didn't vote the way we vote today. We didn't always vote it the way we vote today. In fact, historically, foundational Black Americans, we originally supported the Democratic Party after the Civil War. And there was a specific reason for that. Now, over time, FBA voting patterns did change. Not randomly, though, but in response to laws, policies, economic realities, and historical events. So today, we're not just looking at one particular political party. We're looking at the political system as a whole, and we asking the question: how did policy decisions shape the economic and social position of foundational Black Americans over time? Because we finally regaining a political position in society. From the end of the Civil War moving forward, the American political system didn't just accidentally fail foundational Black Americans. In many periods of history, policies and laws actually helped create conditions that kept foundational Black Americans in a lower and social economic position. And the way this happened changed depending on the time period. But the overall pattern is something many historians has pointed out. After Reconstruction, though, many foundational Black Americans was prevented from voting through things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation like the KKK and things like that. During the Jim Crow era, segregation shaped everyday life, where people could live, where children could go to school, the jobs people could access, and even access to government programs. It made it easy for them to keep us away from government programs when we were segregated. Later on, even after legal segregation ended, inequality continued through areas like the criminal justice system, housing patterns, school funding systems, felony disenfranchisement laws, change to voting protections. Over time, these conditions affected the ability of many foundational Black Americans to build wealth, access to education, full participant in elections, and gain equal political representation. Because right now, we have no political representation. So when we look at history across multiple areas, Many scholars argue that the structure of laws, policies, and enforcement decisions played a major role in shaping long-term economic and social outcome. And when we look at our long-term and social economic outcomes, we've been bamboozled. But that part of history is going to explain Black voting shifts far better than any simple story about party labels. FBA voters initially aligned with Republicans because Republicans was the party of Union victory, emancipation, Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment, and the federal enforcement against Black terror, while the Democrats in 1868 explicitly demanded state control over slavery. They denounced the Freedmen Bureau and they attacked what they called Negro supremacy. Black men could really only vote in areas that were central to Republican power during Reconstruction. Foundational Black Americans wasn't allowed to vote in areas dominated under Democratic rule. The shift of many Black voters toward the Democratic Party, that didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual change that took place over many decades. In fact, the shift started in northern states first because in much of the South, Black Americans were still being prevented from voting through intimidation, violence, and legal barriers. Now, one major factor was that after Reconstruction ended, many FBAs felt the Republican Party was no longer strongly enforcing protection against discrimination and racial violence, including they failed to pass the federal anti-lynching laws. So the Republicans didn't want to pass a law to stop them from lynching us. And they was using the lynching as a form of intimidation for us not to vote. Another important factor was that the Great Migration, when millions of foundational Black Americans moved from the South to northern and western cities, in those places, their votes had more impact. And politicians began to recognize Black voters as an important part of the election. During the 1930s, New Deal programs also played a role. Even though some of those programs excluded Black workers, the economic relief they provided still influenced political support, especially during the Great Depression. Now, over time, the Democratic Party increasingly relied on forms of Black voters in urban areas. And this relationship continued to develop through the 1940s, the 1950s, but especially in the 1960s. By the mid-1960s, they had major civil rights laws. Laws like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act, fair housing policies, all that passed with strong support from Democratic leadership in Congress. At the same time, Republican leaders, they began emphasizing policies focused on local government control. They wanted to limit federal involvement and take a more law and order approach to crime. These policy differences, along with the impact of civil rights legislations, helped solidify a major shift in voting patterns amongst foundational Black Americans that continue into this day and age. When we look at the actual voting data over time, it supports the idea that this political shift didn't happen gradually. One important thing to understand is that early voting data is not always perfect. especially before the 1930s. Now, that's because foundational Black Americans in the South were still being prevented from voting. And early poll methods didn't always include enough Black participants to give a full, accurate picture of the voting patterns at that time. But even with those limitations, historical estimates still show a clear pattern. A major shift toward the Democratic Party begun around 1936, during the time of the New Deal and the Great Depression. Then we see an even more significant shift around 1964, which aligned with the Civil Rights Act and major changes in civil rights policies. From that point forward, Democratic candidates remained very strong among Black voters through the late 1900s and into the early 2000s. More recently, data from 2024 shows slight changes in voting patterns amongst FBAs, but not a complete political realignment yet. But we're going to see after 2026 how much more that curve is going. Reconstruction was the first time in American history that foundational Black Americans was able to participate in politics on a large scale. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was passed that made it illegal to deny the right to vote based on race. Now, during this time, the federal government also required Southern states to create new constitutions that allowed Black men to vote, because they still wasn't allowing FBAs to vote in the South. As a result, Black Americans began voting in large numbers, and many was elected into political office. Shoot, more foundational Black Americans probably was elected in a political office than what we do now, because every Black politician that's in office now, they not FBA. By around the 1870s, the Republican Party controlled many Southern state governments, and Black lawmakers was serving in important leadership positions. Back then, that was foundational Black American lawmakers in those positions. We don't have that no more. By 1877, historians estimate that roughly 2,000 Black men had held public office at the local and federal level across the South. I wonder if that number is still up there now. Can you believe that? Way back then, we had more political representation. We don't got none right now. So Black voters was not just participating back then. There was a major political force and played the key role in shaping government during this period. Some moderate economic research also found that areas with Black political leadership during Reconstruction saw real improvement in society. Something we ain't seeing with the lack of representation we got, because we don't got nobody, we don't have no political representation. Foundational Black Americans, we ain't got no political representation right now. The only ones we got is the grassroots, and the grassroots is stepping up. But in political office, we don't have no political representation. These areas where you saw all these Black lawmakers and stuff, these areas experienced increase in tax revenue for foundational Black Americans, expansions of public schools, and reduction in illiteracy among foundational Black Americans. The point I'm making is that you see we was getting something for our vote. even back then, black people was politically sophisticated enough to know, like, if I'm voting, I'm gonna get something for this. I'm not voting blindly. So, in other words, when foundational black Americans was able to fully participate politically, you saw measurable improvements in education and in public institutions that had long-term effect. Shit, we still benefiting off the work the ancestors put in back in the day. So yes, the shit they did definitely had long-term effect, because the work they put in is why we in the position we in right now. Now, when we look at why many foundational black Americans originally supported the Republican Party after the Civil War, it wasn't based on emotion. It was based on policy. And that's all the grassroots is trying to say right now. Take the emotion out of your vote and vote based on policy. At that time, the Republican Party was the political party that was publicly supporting Reconstruction, equal civil rights, and voting rights for formerly enslaved foundational black Americans. Now, for example, the Republican Party's 1868 platform openly supported equal political rights and equal voting rights for black men in the South. On the other hand, the Democratic Party platform during that same time took a very different position. Many Democratic leaders argued that voting rights should be decided at the state level rather than protected by the federal government. And you know what they was going to do at the state level? Not allow black, foundational black Americans, to vote. The Democrats also supported ending programs like the Freedmen Bureau. The Democratic Party at that time also supported ending programs like the Freedmen Bureau, which had been created to help formerly enslaved people transition into freedom through education, legal assistance, and economic support. It's good we mentioning this because we got to know the roots of, things we support. So when we look at this in historical context, many black voters supported the Republican Party at that time because it was the major political party advocating for federal protection of their citizenship and their voting rights. And when we got our voting rights, we know how to use it to get real life results. Whereas you got Al Sharpton and all of them want you to vote with no real life results coming out of it. Meanwhile, many Democratic leaders was advocating for more state control, which often allowed southern states to pass laws that limited the rights of foundational black Americans. Democratic leaders. The end of Reconstruction didn't just change election results. It changed the entire political system in the South. In 1877, federal troops was withdrawn from southern states as part of what is known as the Compromise of 1877. When they withdrew those federal troops had been helping enforce the civil rights protections that foundational black Americans gained after the Civil War. Our civil rights was being protected under federal protection. Once those troops was removed, many Southern political leaders, often called the Redeemers, worked to reestablish white political control at the state level. They did this through new state constitutions, through intimidation and violence, and through labor system that limited economic freedoms. Now, see, look at our political power when we had that federal protection. As soon as they removed the federal troops, look what happened. According to these historical records from National Park Service, the withdrawal of federal protection made it easier for southern states to begin rolling back many of the rights that had been gained during Reconstruction. See, the long term, we fight for stuff for our struggle, and then the long term, in the long run, we get stripped of everything. We get bamboozled some type of way. For example, Mississippi 1890 state constitution became a model for other states. It introduced measures like poll taxing, resident requirement, and literacy tests, of all which made it much harder for many foundational Black Americans to vote. Historical records from the National Archives show that certain Supreme Court decisions during this period weakened federal enforcement of voting rights protections. In cases like the United States versus Crookshaw, the United States versus Reese, the court limited the federal government ability to prosecute violations to Black voting rights. So the state was able to just go willy-nilly, and we ain't had no federal protection to protect us from the racist ass state laws. As a result, many states was able to restrict voting rights using laws that did not explicitly mention race, but still had the effect of reducing Black political participation. So even though the law technically said voting rights couldn't be denied based on race, the system was redesigned in ways to still limit access to the ballot. Now, when we talk about the Jim Crow era, violence wasn't just random. It was often used as a way to control political participation. That's where a lot of the violence came from. Historical research shows that violence and intimidation had a direct effect on voting behavior. For example, some economic research has found that when lynchings occurred in a county, Black voter turnouts in the following election will often drop significantly. See, they was using that fear and intimidation. Them lynchings, they was using them lynchings to keep us away from them voting polls. The impact didn't stop in just one location when they was doing those lynchings in those counties. Violence in nearby areas also created fear that discouraged political participation. That shit was spread throughout counties. Black people wouldn't want to vote from the next county, all because of that violent intimidation. Boy, lynching was a bitch. Other research connect racial violence during this time period to efforts to maintain political control in the South after Reconstruction. Historical records also show that Black political leadership in Black communities was often targeted during periods when Black American was gaining influence in government, especially when policies begin affecting taxes, public education, and local political power. Other words, violence and intimidation was something strategically to reduce political violence and intimidation was used strategically to reduce political participation and maintain existing power structures, which they still do that to a certain degree, because look how they disrespect us and treat us, talk to us violently, you could say, for demanding our votes as Black voters to the Democratic Party. Economic inequality, it didn't just happen by accident during this time period. It was shaped by laws and policies after the Civil War. Even though the 13th Amendment officially ended slavery, new systems was created that still restricted economic freedoms for many foundational Black Americans. For example, Black codes was laws passed in southern states that limited where Black Americans could work, travel, and live. There were also laws called pig laws, which created very harsh penalties for minor offenses. Because of these types of laws, many foundational Black Americans was arrested for small infractions and then forced into labor through a system known as convict leasing. Now, convict leasing allowed prisoners to be leased out to private businesses where they was often worked in fucked up conditions. Now, historical research has shown that this system functioned in ways that kept foundational Black Americans in a vulnerable economic position even after formal slavery had ended. But during this time period, voting restrictions limited political power, and that often affect how public resources was distributed. Segregated schools often received fewer resources, public service were unequal, and economic opportunities was limited in many foundational Black American communities. And I still see this to this day. When I drive through New Orleans, when I'm driving through the East, we underfunded. Shit, they about to close the school down in Michoud, the Black areas. So when some historians say that the political system helped maintain an economic underclass, they're referring to how voting restrictions, labor policies, education systems, and criminal justice practice often work together over time, shaping long-term economic outcome. One important thing to understand is that Black political progress during this time did not only come from national leaders, it came from strong local communities, like the grassroots. I'm talking about the grassroots to this present day. During Reconstruction, many of the most important political efforts was organized at the local level through churches, community groups, mutual aid, societies, and local political meetings. These groups help Black Americans, foundational Black Americans, work together to improve education, protect voting rights, and build stronger communities. Historical records show that local conventions and grassroots coalitions played a major role in shaping policies during this time period. We also see examples of Black political leaders who were able to directly influence government policies. One example is John R. Lynch. He served in Congress during Reconstruction and helped shape laws that affect civil rights and political participation for foundational Black Americans. Even after Reconstruction ended, Black leaders and organizations continued pushing for change even during the Jim Crow era, when voting rights was heavily restricted in many southern states. Now, for example, Ida B. Wells led major anti-lynching campaigns, using journalism to expose racial violence and bring national attention to foundational Black American issues. Same thing kind of like what the Black media does for us today. Because if it wasn't for the Black media in America, if it wasn't for the foundational Black American media, we wouldn't hear about a lot of things that happen to us, because mainstream media never mentions anything that happened to us. So big up to the Black media, foundational Black American media. So even during periods when political participation was limited, Black communities continue organizing, continue continuing the effort to expand civil rights and political representation, which which that's what the grassroots is doing now. We speaking up, man. We need political representation. Shit, all I see is immigrant representation right now. Let me get some water real quick. Yeah, we don't have nobody up the bat on the political sphere for foundational Black Americans. Now, as we move into the time period of the New Deal, that's when voting patterns start to become more complex. The New Deal was not a simple turning point where everything suddenly became equal, but it also was not unimportant. What made the New Deal significant is that it changed which political party was closely associated with economic programs that provided direct help to everyday people. During the Great Depression, many Americans were struggling financially, including many foundational Black Americans who moved to northern cities during the Great Migration. At that time, Democratic administrations was often connected to programs that provided relief, job opportunities, labor protection, and economic support in urban areas. Because of this, many foundational Black Americans in northern cities were able to compare the parties based on real life economic outcome. And that's what the grassroots try to tell us as foundational Black Americans. Base our vote on real life economic outcome. If they're not talking about that, what are we talking about? Meanwhile, the Republican Party during this period was often associated with older governing approach that focused less on direct economic distribution through federal programs. But there was the Republicans at that time was getting those federal programs. They just wanted to funnel it to them because the rich get a lot of welfare and government support. Y'all don't know about that. Rich people are more government leechers than people on welfare, low key. However, it is important to understand that many new deal programs didn't benefit foundational Black Americans. Historical records show that the original Social Security Act in 1935, which came through the New Deal, excluded certain types of workers, particularly agriculture workers and domestic workers. At that time, a large percent of foundational Black Americans workers was employed in those occupations, meaning many foundational Black Americans was not able to fully benefit from those early Social Security protections. The job markets we dominated, they didn't allow to be protected under Social Security. Some labor protections under laws like Wagner Act, the Wagner Act, some labor protections under laws like the Wagner Act also excluded many agriculture workers, which agriculture workers at that time was dominated by foundational Black Americans. So the New Deal period created little opportunity and a lot of limitation. It expanded some economic support, but still leaving big gaps to access for foundational Black Americans. One of the major concerns people raise when looking at history is that policies passed by both major parties have not produced long-term economic outcomes. We still not seeing improved conditions within foundational Black American communities. Basically, no matter who we voted for up to this point, we have not got any results, no long-term results. Whether we voted Republican, whether we voted Democrat, in the long run, we ended up with nothing. Look at us right now. Over time, we see that benefits connected to civil rights legislation, economic reforms, and social programs expands across society broadly, while disparities in wealth, home ownership, education, business ownership still continues to affect FBA communities in a negative way, systematically keeping us an underclass in the country that we built the wealth of. Despite us being one of the most consistent and influential voting blocs in American history, foundational Black Americans still face the largest gap in generational wealth and economic security. FBA communities play a central role in building the economic foundation of the United States through our labor, our innovation, our culture, and our civic participation. Yet, long-term policy outcomes have not reflected our contributions. Because of this, political participation must be paired with clear political expectations and outcomes so that the interest of the community is clearly addressed over time. We looking for long-term benefits, long-term progress, not make us feel good for the moment and then at the end, we ain't got 2 nickels to rub. You know what I'm saying? Lineage business. We got to save ourselves. If we don't use our power, if we ain't learn nothing else, if we don't use our power and we don't use our own struggle to benefit us, somebody else will. Somebody else going to use our power and our benefits to benefit them. Fuck that. We might as well use our powers and shit to benefit us. Shit. Once we good, then we can help other motherfuckers. But hey, foundational Black Americans, we must rise. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Now, when we step back and look at this entire history, one pattern becomes very clear. Foundational Black Americans have consistently fought to expand democracy in the United States, often at the highest cost. Our lives and our benefit. From Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement to modern day elections. FBA community organize, protest, vote, and push this country to live up to its own institution. America wouldn't live up to its institution if foundational Black Americans didn't stay on their necks demanding to be treated equally and just be treated right like a human being, which we still struggling with that. Because, boy, the way they treat us politically in Louisiana, man, they treat us like a dog. Many of the rights that exist today was brought in by foundational Black, was through the foundational Black American struggle. Now, when we look at the long-term results, FBA communities received the smallest share of the economic benefit that came from the changes that was made through our struggles and our fight and our plight. We received the smallest economic benefit, but bills be in our name, but get funneled to, come on, make it make sense. The data on wealth, home ownership, business ownership, and generational assets show that the gap still exists. the wealth gap, even decades after the major legal victories of civil rights era. So we didn't voted for Republicans, we didn't voted for Democrats, and still ended up with the same thing: empty hands and an empty pocket. This raises an important question. If foundational Black American communities play such a major role in expanding rights in America, why have the material outcome remained so unequal? Why the ones who deserve the most get the least? Historical Black Americans shift our political support when we believe policies will produce real improvement in our lives. If we ain't voting unless we see real improvement through our lives, and we need our own political representation, because nobody's up there who's in a political position speaking up for what we need. And I hate to say this, man, they only speak up for what immigrants need, bro. They act like we don't exist. But over time, many of these policy promises made by both parties haven't translated into long-term gains for FBA communities. No matter who we voted for, we never got nothing long-term. The stuff we thought for us ended up really being lined up to benefit other people. We still have yet to get something that benefit us. So the lesson in this history shows this: political loyalty without measurable outcome can leave a community politically active but economically stagnant. Every major political group in America advocates for its own interests. Every major voting bloc negotiates for policies that benefit their community. That's called political intelligence. Politics is a business transaction. Every major voting bloc negotiates for policies that benefits their community. History shows that foundational Black American voters must think strategically about how political influence is used, because we have a lot of political influence. We just got to know how to finesse it. We are probably the most political influential people in this country. And what outcomes is being produced over time? We got to use our political influence, make sure our political influence is used, and what outcomes is being produced over time from our political influence. FBA have a lot of political influence. It's one of our most powerful tools we can use. Historical records show that voting patterns have changed before, and they change when voters evaluate which policies produce real-world results. Understanding this history is important, because being an informed community put us in a position to advocate for policies and directly benefit a long-term economic stability, political representation, and generational progress. Because right now we are in the progress of getting political representation. Democrats or Republicans, none of them, nobody's representing us politically. Nobody's talking about what we need. You know, on a political level, they act like we good. Black Americans straight, they don't need shit. That's how we get treated. So understanding this voting pattern in history, understanding this history is important, because being an informed community puts us in a position to advocate for policies that directly benefit our long-term economic stability, political representation, and generational progress. So the central question moving forward is not simply who received the vote, but what is being delivered in return from our vote. And on that note, FBA Stoic gonna close this thing out. So that was just a surface touching on the voting patterns throughout history, how we started out voting Republican. We had a lot of political power when we started out voting Republican, but Republicans started turning cold. They lynching us to keep us from voting. Republicans don't want to support anti-lynching laws. What we had to do, peace out. Voted for another bot, turned Democrat. So we started out Republican, turned Democrat, voted for them super long. At the end of the day, what results we got from that? Nothing. So we done did the Democratic thing. We done did the Republican thing. What's next? What's next is we do our own thing. And what our own thing is, hey, maybe coming up with our own party, but it's definitely using our political power. We have a lot of political power that we could use. Our votes are probably the most important votes in America. Our votes gonna determine who gonna get in office. So we done went Republican, we done went Democrat. Hey, it's time to do our thing. It's time to prioritize us. It's time to do things that's gonna benefit foundational Black American long term. We ain't voting for nothing that in the beginning you use our struggle to get it passed, but then the resources get finagled to other groups, everybody but us. That time is over with, you know. So that was the history of voting patterns. If you ain't getting nothing tangible, don't support it. It's okay for us to demand. Everybody's getting support from the government. Everybody is getting something for their group. Ain't nothing wrong with us getting our piece of the pie because we built the wealth of this country. Political awareness, man. Demanding something for your group ain't begging. Don't ever think that. Demanding something for your group ain't begging, bro. So, you know, we owe politically by both parties technically, but the most recent party is the one who's going to ante up. Peace. I'm going to catch y'all on the next one. Peace out, fam.